For this segment, I'd like to walk you through how to populate the tool. Because of the training format, it can seem a little drawn out, but the truth is it's actually a fairly quick and easy process. Now I have some files that I've prepared ahead of time, and that will be required for making sure that you're balancing your PM schedules. But the truth is, none of these files is absolutely required. In all reality, you could enter into the Viewport and start hand jamming any of this equipment in. We've increased the functionality by implementing the PM1 report as a baseline for it, but by no means does it rely on the PM1 report. There's also an additional file for zones, and this is something that bases would be expected to develop on their own, but at the same time, you can assume, at the very least, that all facilities are in Zone 1 and drop zones entirely. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into these documents. The first of them is the zones document. This is essentially a list of facilities and the zones that those facilities fall within. All we did was go to our shop, have them draw some circles on a map, and take that map to the EA shop so that they could give us the facilities that fell within those circles. We'll be using this in the Viewport tool by copying the data out and pasting it into the Zone Management tab, as you'll see soon. The other document is the PM1 report. And in essence, this is the same vanilla PM1 report that's generated by Builder with only a very slight modification. All of the assets that we do not care to schedule have been deleted out. Now, there are easy ways of doing this, so I suggest getting with one of your Excel gurus at your local base to make sure that the list that you start with represents only the assets you want to schedule. Now the third and final document is the PM Viewport tool. The moment we open this, the first thing you should notice is that the security warning prompts us to enable content so that macros can be enabled. Please do so. Now that we've enabled macros, I'd like you to see something. When you open this document, there are in fact two windows that open. This is because we've intended for this document to be utilized on a dual monitor setup. Ideally, you would have this screen, which represents the data screen, though not yet populated, on one monitor. And then you would have the other screen, the one you're more familiar with, on the second monitor. By having this setup, you can move from one tab to the other without having to actually make any changes, and it all becomes much simpler and more efficient process. For the purposes of presentation, I'm going to go ahead and close down my second window. And one more thing that I'm going to do for the presentation is I'm going to minimize and hide my ribbon. If I go to the auto hide function in Excel 2013, it gives me a lot more real estate for the presentation. So I'm going to leave it like this and we should be good to go. At this point, we need to start populating this document. So the Zone Management tab represents all of the connections that are made between our facilities and the zones that they're in. And all I'm going to do is move to my Zones document, as you saw before, and select the facilities and zones that are present, copy them out, move back to the PM Viewport, select the first cell in the table and press values, paste values. Now that we've done this, we can move back to our PMTL Assignments tab. Now this is a tab that you're not familiar with. You're familiar with the analysis tools because the graphs that are provided for us are provided for analytical purposes. But the PMTL Assignments tab is the tab that really gets everything going. This is our data tab, and we will make sure and populate this with data from that PM1 report that I showed you. Now this document does not explicitly rely on the PM1 report. The tool does not need it. But what we've done is to increase some functionality to make it a little more efficient for those that are working with that report. We're going to assume that you're working with the PM1 report. So please note two things. First of all, there's a button for importing it. That should be fairly self-explanatory. But the other thing to notice is that this red square actually asks you to input the name of that file. As long as that file is properly named and it's located in the same directory as the Viewport tool, when you click import, it will bring all of that data into this document. And it does take a second. For this particular record set, I believe I'm importing 3,000 records. That is equivalent, of course, to 3,000 assets. And as you might expect, because this is a spreadsheet, it can take a while to work with such large amounts of data and the calculations needed to do what this spreadsheet does. The first thing I'd like you to note is that columns B through E have a header that's brown. This header states that these columns are not necessary for calculation, so you can remove them completely. You can change their feature. We've set them as a default to the PM1 report because it can help with cross-referencing whatever changes you make back into PM1 or Builder. But for now, it's important to note that you can add columns to this region and delete columns from it. The next region over consists of columns F through U. These columns are representative of the hours for each frequency type on any particular asset. You'll notice we have weekly, monthly, on up through semi-annually and annually, plus a division that separates the standard frequency types from the extra annual frequency types. One last thing to note is that this column, semi-monthly, is not calculated. It's a limitation of the way that this document was created. But this is an effective 80 to 90% solution. So of the two regions that we've seen one that's not required, and we've seen one that absolutely is. The next region is the actual working region, and these are dates. I'll explain the start exclusion zone and stop exclusion zones, but for the most part, column X, the last annual PM date column, is where we're going to be spending most of our time. It's this column that specifies the date that annual PM is performed on any particular asset. The last region is the region of red items, and these are calculated cells. I'll explain their use as we continue, but I think the first one that you can note is that the zones here are now cross-referenced. So building 5257 is actually a Zone 1 facility, and it's drawing that from the Zone Management tab. The final thing to comment on at this stage in the segment is that each row represents one asset to be PM'd. There is no quantity. So if you have 200 VAV boxes, you're going to need, unfortunately, to copy those 200 VAV boxes out in your original PM1 report. Now, there is currently a team at AFCEC working on trying to identify how best to do this kind of stuff for you. But again, I'm going to go back to what I said before. That report that you have represents the assets that you're scheduling. Another option that you have, if you don't want to copy out 200 VAV boxes, which nobody could be blamed for not wanting to do that, is you could take the number of hours and multiply those hours by 200 and keep those within this frequency. While I said before that these frequencies are required for calculation, you are entirely allowed to change those frequencies within the document. Okay, so to back up, what you see in front of you is the data set that's feeding the graph that we've already started to understand. The key highlights are that there's a region you can modify, There's a region that you can modify but you need to keep in place, and there's a region that you must modify. The final point that we talked about is that each row represents one asset to be PM'd. Now that we've gotten to this point, we are almost ready to start adding dates, but there's one more item that we have to discuss before starting down that path. What follows in this presentation is a method or a recommendation on how to balance your assets. But the truth is, this tool is so new that not even we as the developers know how best to use it. We're hoping that you'll be able to find ways to do it better, but this should be a good way to get things started. Now I'd like to take this moment to discuss what we've covered. So if you'll make sure that you're adding your questions and comments to the chat box, we can take a brief amount of time to discuss your concerns.